All right, part three in the Olivet Discourse. I have to say, this is disclosure here before we actually get into the video. I lost about two-thirds of the video footage, but the audio is crisp, so you can still test what I share. It's unfortunate. The verdict is I need to get a new camera. So, that being said, it's not critical that you actually see this handsome face of mine, but that you focus on the word of God that is being shared and to test that. So, in the near future, Lord willing, we'll get a new camera, but that's where we're at. So, in case you're wondering why there's a church history backdrop again, I'm battling with the tech demons still. Welcome to part three in the Olivet Discourse. So, this video, we're going to pick up where we left off, which was verse 28 in Matthew 24. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. A rotting corpse, that would be Jerusalem, or an injured entity in the desert. And then, of course, ravening birds would circle these things and pick them apart. And that's kind of what we see what's going on here, especially by AD 70 when Rome plundered Jerusalem, sacked the temple. Every brick was stripped down to draw the gold out of the cracks that melted from the temple burning. So, before we move on with verses 29 now and onward, I want to do a recap of the decreation theme that is woven into the text so far. I think there's a case here. Test me on this. I haven't come across this yet, but I think there's something there. From day one of creation to the seventh day and Sabbath, Jesus, the master prophet, has woven this into his essentially judgment prophecy. And of course, whenever there's a judgment on the land, the prophets give an ark that you can heed, and after the dust settles, there's always, in a sense, a new heavens and earth that comes about, right? New inhabitants will fill the land and sort of rebuild, recreate, if you will. So, I'm going to read here from my notes that I've written in microcosm as best as I can. I don't know if you can see that if you're watching. By the way, if you're curious what pen I use to help a guy out, don't use pilots, but use these Micron point, I think they're 005s. They work pretty well on onion skin thin paper without bleeding through the pages, unlike most pens. So, anyways, all right. So I have here for day one, rather than the beginning of creation, we have a beginning of the close of an age, followed by a series of decreation themes for each day of creation of Genesis. Of day two, we move on to verses 4 through 6. We see light and darkness, Jesus, the light of the world, and the false Christs and rumors as darkness. Day 3, which rolls into verses 6 and 7, is regarding the nations as the sea and the waters above as heaven. And we see a division of kingdoms, realms, and nations, and how they would clash instead of being separate. So, in other words, when you read about day 3, God separates the waters, from the waters from heaven and earth. And here in Jesus' prophecy, we're seeing that the nations are going to clash. They're going to come into contact with each other, no longer being separate or at peace, if you will. And more on day 3 also. The latter half in verse 7 dealing with famines and earthquakes being affiliated with matters of land/earth revealed on day 3. Plants bearing fruit and grain are now stricken with famine, and the earth groans with hunger. Hence, verse 8 talks about the beginning of birth pains. So I think there's something there with day 3 for sure at this point. Then we move on to day 4. We see a fall of the stars, i.e. the brothers betraying one another, and the light of Christ being persecuted in verses 9 and 10. If you look at Joseph's dream, with his brothers in Genesis, the different stars of Israel, or the constellations of these different brothers, were around Joseph. And I believe his mother and his father are the moon and the sun. And so these astrological figures, at times, as I'll talk about in a little bit, the luminaries can have a motif of being rulers or judges and authorities of the heavenly principalities in the cosmos, as well as just teachers, rulers in the church, I should say, leaders in the church. If they become a wandering star, then they're a false teacher, because the stars and the luminaries were created on day 4 to govern the day and night, to provide a calendar, time rulers, if you will, for God's people to look at. So astrologists and astronomists would look to these things for guidance. And so I think a case can be made too. Last thing I'll say with astrology here, when you look at Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, the sky proclaims his handiwork. I don't believe that is merely just getting at, you look up and you go, oh, wow, look at the glory of God. And what it's proclaiming his majesty. That's part of it, sure, but I think there's more there, because if you keep reading Psalm 19, it talks about essentially there's written revelation in the sky. And so I'm kind of jumping the gun here with day 5, but in a nutshell, the written word supersedes the natural revelation of the stars. And of course, like with the cults who like to twist the written word and pervert it, pagans throughout the ages have twisted the revelation in the stars to fit their sinful depiction of what they want God to be, rather than how he's revealed himself. More could be said on that, but I digress. Day 5, false prophets are wandering stars or birds who prophesy falsities, unlike birds in Noah's day who brought back news of dry land, or a good word. You look at the Roman practices with divination and omen seeking through birds. I think it's called augury. Look at Norse mythology and Norse pagan views, looking at the raven for omens, etc. There's something there between birds and prophecy. And of course, a good word from Noah's birds brought back the olive branch of land. There's a connection there with day 5. God created birds on the 5th day. And so this is with verse 11. Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. Stars are in the heavens, just like the birds fly around in the sky, So something there. Maybe someone can polish that up. Day 6. This is definitely day 6. You see in verse 15, the abomination of desolation. Daniel the prophet is mentioned. Okay, Daniel's a man. This abomination of desolation, beasts, Nebuchadnezzar turns into a beast while he's ruling in Daniel's day. There's something there with that. And then last would be day 7, Sabbath. Go down to verse, where was it? Verse 20. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. So you have parallels with the 7 days of creation woven into the Olivet Discourse. And of course, for the righteous, rather than all this decreation language being a judgment upon them, this is decreation language upon the wicked. The righteous or the meek will inherit the earth. And those who heeded the arc of Jesus's words, which, sure enough, if you keep reading, Noah gets brought into this. So it's like we're chronologically working through Genesis in the Olivet. Haven't gone any further than that, but I'm sure there's more interesting parallels going on. If you heed the words of this, you will escape the wrath to come. So let's move on. Verse 29. Immediately, I'll read this section here. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven a sign of the Son of Man, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So, there is some debate amongst postmillennialists as far as verse 29 goes. As far as the timing of these things, I think we're all on the same page. We believe these things happened within the first century by AD 70. But some have said that this is talking about the nations, and I'm not going to explain that hermeneutic, but I'll share with you what I'm more convicted what it is. I think what's going on here, Jesus is taking a prophetic, dramatic, astrological judgment that we see in Isaiah 13, verse 10, dealing with Babylon that Isaiah prophesied, judgment upon them. And if you know what Babylon's worship is centered around, it's astrological. I've got a list here from Sin, if I'm pronouncing these right, Sin, the moon, Ishtar, Venus, Enlil, the air, Anu, the sky, Marduk, the thunder, or the supreme thunder, Utnu, I think that's what it is, the sun, etc. These are sort of heavenly luminaries that they worshipped. And so when they are told in Isaiah, the Babylonians, that God's going to make their sun, moon, and stars basically not give light anymore, that's God saying, I'm going to knock your lights out and your gods are going to crumble. Okay. And when you take that into account with all of the Babylonian language that's on the covenant-breaking Jews, that's riddled all throughout Revelation, example gracia, the harlot riding the beast, drinking the blood of the saints with Babylon written on her forehead, that's the covenant-breaking Jews. That's Jerusalem in her corrupt version, if you will. And so she's this whore, Babylon. And there's much more on that. Zechariah, I believe, chapter 4 or 5, has this like counterfeit temple going on, which is essentially a Babylonian ziggurat with Babylonian worship that's sort of seen on the other side. If you were to put on glasses that looks at the spiritual realm, that's what you would see going on with the temple in Jesus' day. It would have turned into a Babylonian ziggurat with all sorts of, false gods in the temple. But the Jews, they didn't, on the outside, it didn't seem as though they were worshiping all these other gods. In fact, that's why I think they would have taken this as extremely offensive. They would have been like, who are you telling us that our sun, moon, and stars are going to fall? That's what was told to the Babylonians. We're not Babylon. We don't worship Marduk and Ishtar and whatever. But Jesus, being prophetic, he's laying it down on them in this Babylonian judgment language. He sees in their heart of hearts that they are not in covenant with Yahweh, but they would rather worship man-made traditions and other idols, if you will, rather than follow the one true God and the Messiah right before them, whom they rejected. Now, Joel. Oh, yeah, I was going to mention Joel as well. His book is primarily, I believe, dealing with the Assyrians. They're this massive army of locusts that's coming in the first couple chapters. It sounds like the Romans, if you read Joel. It does seem like, oh, yeah, that's a phalanx coming in, and they're scaling the walls, and that might be AD 70 going on. No, there are many ancient battles that happened before AD 70, and so I think what's going on there is the Assyrians is what he's talking about. And then sort of chiastically, towards the end of chapter 2, part of 3, he talks about the near or I'm sorry, the distant future of what we see in Acts when they say, hey, this was prophesied in Joel, the prophesying and speaking in tongues and these sort of things. That's happening now. He talks, Joel mentions about a blood moon, sun wearing sackcloth, and the stars not giving light or falling. And what I think that is hitting on is more of the Jewish religious judgment more directly, as far as blood moon. That would be their sanctuary, their temple, which was all their festivals were orchestrated based on the clock of the moon. The lunar calendar, if you will, is what sort of guided them in their festivals. And so a blood moon would be a bad omen. And I believe when they were destroyed in AD 70, the city was swollen because they were having a feast, celebrating, thinking they had defeated the Romans. So the worst time to have a feast and have your city swollen with people burning through all that food, and then all of a sudden you're sieged. The moon, I believe, would have likely turned to blood. And if it didn't, spiritually speaking, once the Romans came in and slaughtered, I think, about 20,000 Jews in the temple, their temple would have been spewing out rivers of blood. That's just in the temple alone. Josephus is quite graphic in what he records. And then the sackcloth of the sun would be the rulers weeping. Sackcloth is tied to lament and weeping. And so anyone who survived the sun, their rulers, were eclipsed with sackcloth. And then their teachers, all the religious leaders that were slaughtered, were no longer their guides. And so the lights went out. So that's what's going on in verse 29. I don't believe this has anything to do with nuclear missiles or the elitists trying to block out the sun or global warming or anything like that. All righty. Now let's look at verse 30. This may seem like there's no way this happened in the first century, but I submit that the timing of this did. So then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, Jesus, if you remember, in Matthew 26, verse, was it 64? When Jesus is standing before the high priest and the council, before he is brought to Pilate to be crucified, Jesus says something along the lines of, from now on, you will see the Son of Man standing with power and full glory at the right hand of the Father. And the high priest says, well, you heard it from him. Blasphemy. He deserves to die. Okay. At this point, anyone who died, I think, would see that Jesus is the, ruler of the heavens and earth. And so even in Josephus's work, I believe, I don't have the reference, you'll have to check me on this, but I've heard it said that, actually, maybe I even read it, that something about the sky had a strange, glorious phenomenon about it when they were being judged by the Romans. And so there may have very well manifested in the physical realm something going on in the clouds when the Jews were judged, covenant breaking Jews. But let's talk about the cloud theme or motif with judgment in the Bible. Let's see here. First off, you can follow me here in Isaiah 19:1. This is an oracle concerning Egypt, not back in Moses' day, but another instant in history. This would have been after the Assyrians, approaching the time of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar being the whip or the scourge of God that would sort of come through and judge the Levant for her pagan ways. And Egypt is mentioned here. Isaiah 19, an oracle concerning Egypt. Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. And the idols of the Egyptians will tremble at his presence, and the heart of the Egyptians will melt within them. And I will stir up Egyptians against Egyptians, and they will fight each other, or they will fight each against another, and each against his neighbor, etc. Okay, so this is what we're seeing recurring multiple times in Scripture. Judgments happen. God raises an army. He calls them his army, which would have been Babylon this time. Part of the judgments of, what is it? War, famine, pestilence, and earthquakes, which, by the way, you can tie those into the four elements of the world. It's like he's using the elements of the world against you. War with fire, earthquakes, the earth, of course, pestilence, air, and then water with famine. Anyways, he also does delusions upon people, and that's why you hear the Egyptians turning against each other. But let's look at this and understand that the riding on a swift cloud, I don't believe Yahweh would have literally manifested himself and came in on a cloud. That's just metaphorical language. You're to be terrified of this sort of hurricane / tempest storm that's breaching over the mountains of your nation and is coming in, rolling in with fire, heavenly lightning. That's the imagery that's being depicted here. So that's the picture here. Clouds, judgment. You can look also at, there's a few others here. Isaiah 40:24, Psalm 83:13-15, Jeremiah 23:19. Even Revelation talks about coming in the clouds, which I believe that is exactly what's going on in Matthew 24. And the soonness of this coming in the clouds, I would submit, with the book of Revelation, indicates that that book, the things in it, particularly in the first 20 chapters, already happened, or 19 chapters. And then we have some things to look forward to in the future afterwards. But that, you can look more into my video on the timing of the book of Revelation. So the picture here with clouds is that God's judgment is rolling in. And it may have physically manifested itself, just like Jesus said in Matthew 26:64 or whatever, where they would see him at the right hand of God with power and great glory. When Stephen was martyred, where did he see Jesus? He saw Jesus standing at the right hand of the Father, standing for those who are being martyred for him. But I believe he would also be standing, judging anyone who died from that point on. You would see Christ. Look in Revelation. Can't remember the exact chapter, somewhere in the middle, though, where it talks about how the presence of the Lamb is what hell is for unbelievers. And they don't want anything to do with Christ, the wicked. But they have to, I guess, exist in the eternal presence of the wrath of the Lamb. That is Christ. Everyone knows in this life, we're either embracing this truth or we're suppressing that truth. But once we pass on to the next life, any veil of suppressing the truth is utterly torn and comes into contact with reality. Amen. Now, moving on to that sign of the Son of Man. I believe this is tied to the ascension described in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13-14. I can read that real quick here. Daniel writes, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory, and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, in his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So, I think there's something there with Daniel 13 and this judgment that's going on in the Olivet. Perhaps that's the sign, something going on there. And it goes on to say in Matthew 24:30, I'm sorry. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So this mourning of the tribes is typically connected to, and the earth is connected to the Jews, or God's like covenant people, if you will. And nations is usually tied to the Gentiles. So I think what's going on here is a more local judgment of the Jews, and they would mourn, understanding that they had rejected the Messiah, martyred him and his messengers, and now it's too late. Like, you've been judged, the wrath cup has been poured. Could it mean that the saints are mourning in this? I don't know how that could be concluded, but that's where I'm at so far with this text. And it's like each of these verses is getting more difficult to teach on. So I'm teaching this rather loosely as far as the specifics here. Timing, I'm confident these things happened by AD 70, because what I've been sharing with you so far in these videos is bookended with this generation will not pass away until these things take place. And so the time indicator there would be their generation. I believe I already talked about this in other videos. You don't just get to throw the meaning of timeness around and say generation could mean 2,000 years. It could mean a race. It could be, no. The prophet has given us a time indication here. So according to Deuteronomy 18:20 through 22, we need to see these things come to pass within what he has said as far as timing. Otherwise, the sky's the limit when these things could happen. And so, next verse, 31, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Now, I think what is going on here, James Jordan, in Revelation studies, it's like 120 some videos. You should go watch them. But Revelation 7, I'll read it to you, and it sounds a little interesting, a little similar to this. And I'm surprised he didn't make the connection with Matthew 24. But immediately when he said it in his lecture, I was like, ooh, this might actually be a key to understand what's going on here a bit more. So I'm going to throw this out there, and Lord willing, the right ears hear this, and we can try to develop this a bit more. Okay, so chapter 7, verse 1, Revelation. After I saw this, 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on the sea or against any tree. So here we hear these, I think these are the tetramorphic creatures with the 4 faces, standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth. Now, we were told in Matthew that these angels will gather his elect from the 4 winds from one end of heaven to the other. Now, James ties this to, Zechariah 2, verse 6, where it is also talking about the 4 winds of the earth in that instance. And I can't remember all the context going on in Zechariah, but when you read that whole chapter 2, and when you read all of Revelation 7, at least up until verses 12, it's as though all the people that are surrounding Yahweh, all the angelic hosts, are Yahweh's garment. When we're looking at this verse, I don't know exactly what's being meant here. I mean, is it saying that the angels, like actual angels, not messengers, but angelic beings, with this loud trumpet call, they go and they gather the elect? And like, as 4 winds, are these the host of Yahweh in heaven? Or is this something that can also mean the 4 winds of the earth, as we saw in Revelation 1? It's tricky. I haven't fully thought this out. So just because, though, I don't know exactly what is being said here as far as what it is that is being said. Again, what's most critical is the timing of this. When did this happen? Well, it said these things would happen within their generation. I think that's pretty clear. And so I think there's enough other things that I've been able to share, hopefully faithfully, specifically what those things were, so we can have confidence that everything in this, all of it so far, has happened within the first century. So, to put a pin on this, I humbly submit that I don't know exactly what is being said here. There's some sort of gathering, probably of saints as his messengers, or disciples or angels are harvesting, maybe saints that are being martyred up until this point. He calls them from the four winds. See, that's interesting. From the four winds. But Jordan thinks that the four winds is a name for the spiritual host garment, if you will, of Yahweh. So I don't know. So we'll leave it at that. We'll finish up with this next portion on the fig tree. By the way, if the video cut out... Oh, it cut out all right. Like, pretty much the whole dang video. The video just cuts off. So I don't know how to fix that. But I'll probably just throw up one of my older church history videos or something dealing with this, like I did in the previous videos. Okay. So from the fig tree, verse 32, learn its lesson as soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, so you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you will know that he is near at the very gates. I believe Jeremiah, with a judgment coming in his day, he uses this same fig tree language. It's a pretty straightforward metaphor. And then same with this, at the very gates. When the enemy or when a army is at your gates, you don't have time to leave anymore. The gates are shut. Battle is on, and you better hope that your stronghold is going to hold. Otherwise, you're toast. You're sitting ducks. And that's what happened to the Jews. Now, it goes on. Verse 34. Truly I say to you, this generation... What generation? This generation, the near demonstrative case, the people he was speaking to, which parallels what he told them in 23:36, all the hypocrites, the religious leaders in their day, that he says, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So back to verse 34 in chapter 24. Truly I say to you, this generation will pass away until all these things take place. So just some of these things, like not the Son of Man coming in the clouds things, not that yet. No, it says all these things. So also, I think it's good to note that coming in the clouds, or I should say days of the Lord, because that's mentioned also throughout the epistles, the day of the Lord. It's mentioned all throughout the Old Testament. It's not just the final coming of Christ. I think I mentioned this before. When you're talking to a post-millennialist, they should be more consistent. Rather than saying the second coming of Christ, like that's the final coming, no. They should just be saying final coming of Christ, because there are multiple comings of the Lord, or days of the Lord. I think days of the Lord or comings of the Lord can be viewed synonymously. But I'll read this to you from an ESV study Bible. It says regarding the day of the Lord and the prophets. In fact, I'll show you this. I don't know if you can see that, but you could try to pull those references there if you can read that. I'll just spit off a few examples. So let's see. Isaiah 13. This is dealing with an oracle against Babylon, as I mentioned earlier, using an image of battle. The day of the Lord, or the day of Yahweh, refers to the judgment of Babylon and promises terror and wrath. Zephaniah, using the image of sacrifice. The day of Yahweh refers to judgment coming on Judah and the nations, or to refuge in the Lord for all those who humble themselves. So the day of the Lord can be a day of terror or a day of relief, like those who are being oppressed by the wicked, the day of the Lord is good in the sense that you're being vindicated now. So Zephaniah would have been the time after the Assyrians before the Babylonians came in. So the Babylonians would have been God's army to perform the day of the Lord. And then oftentimes when God uses an army of a pagan nation and the pagan nation doesn't repent, then he judges them with another nation. And there's a day of the Lord that happens on the army he used to perform a day of the Lord. So, last one we'll say here regarding, let's say Joel here. With broad usage, the day of the Lord Yahweh brings a locust invasion. That would have been the Assyrians, as I said, judgment of Israel and to the nations, or of final vindication of God and his people. So these comings and days of the Lord, go read those references if you saw those. Also, apocalyptic language of the land just getting utterly decimated on these days of the Lord. Keep an eye out for that in the prophets. I mean, it's all over the place. Even the Psalms talk about how Yahweh tramples or treads on mountaintops and like floods the dross of these things into the valleys of the wicked and wipes all the inhabitants from the land. The stars falling again with the astrological judgment language. Scorching the earth and all the inhabitants within. I mean, obviously, if he did that, then no one would be alive, right? But like no one, the whole world would be just done and toast. That's God's language for dramatic prophetic judgment on the lands. It's going to feel as though these things are happening, and they manifest to some degree like that, literally, in some cases. But when people say, like, well, do you interpret the Bible literally, or do you just kind of get wishy-washy where it's tough for your hermeneutic to be consistent? I would submit, no, I'm interpreting the scriptures based on the type of literature I'm reading. Okay, I don't believe God literally manifested himself down here and started jumping on top of mountains and causing them to melt and wiping all the inhabitants from the land, including the guy who wrote the Psalms or something. You know what I mean? Like, I'm taking the context of the type of literature I'm reading. So, anyways, where are we at here? Oh yeah. So this generation will not pass away. You can look at that Greek word genea for generation. Matthew earlier in his book uses it to mean a 40-year time period. That is typically what's going on in his use of it. Sure, there's other places in Scripture that try to use it as race, but I would submit being consistent with how he is using it, it wouldn't make sense. And the fact that this is a prophecy that Jesus is giving with time indicators in mind, I find it hard to believe that this is meaning a race. It's a time indicator. Note, too, that the heavens and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away, in verse 35, and we'll end there. If you looked at the temple, the topography of it laid out was the cosmos of the universe. The heavens would be the sanctuary, the land and the earth would be the inner and outer court. And Josephus even writes about this in his Antiquities, I believe 3.77, and Wars 5:6. Go read Wars, book 5, chapter 5, I believe. Yeah. But he talks about how what I just shared, it is the cosmos patterned out in a physical representation of it. And even the fabrics used for the veil in the temple, it was a Babylonian tapestry for this veil, and it would represent the four elements of the universe: crimson for fire, purple for the sea, because you'd have to get the crustaceans from the sea, crush them for the purple dye. Hence, it was quite a lucrative business that Lydia in the Gospels, or in the New Testament, that worked with Paul, she had a purple dye business. So lots of money there, time to make purple dye. Blue represented the sky, and what else? white woven throughout that represented the flax, or came from the flax of the earth. So white represented the earth. And I missed something. Crimson, blue, purple, white. So there's your hyacinthal colors there, woven throughout that with gold thread to represent holiness. So you have a depiction of the cosmos here, and when that would be destroyed, it would be as though symbolically heaven and earth passed away, but Christ's word would by no means pass away. And this was understood in, the Middle East, in their mindset, this metaphorical language of your heavens and earth, your sun, moon, and stars falling. People in Arabia, Islam, if you read older texts, they will use this same language. It doesn't literally mean that the whole heavens and earth is going to just dissolve, but something, the way of life as it was prior to, is radically changing. It's as though there is a new heavens and earth coming out from here. And so that, in a sense, is this Noah motif. After the flood, there was a new heavens and earth, in a sense, and the righteous inherited it. And as we'll find in the next video regarding no one knows the day or hour, and it starts getting into Noah, there's that theme of decreation and recreation and Genesis, going on, woven throughout this. So hopefully that has been a good study. We will pick up next in verse 36. So God bless, and we'll catch you in the next video. Which I'm pretty sure I figured out what's been killing the video footage in some of these videos. So hopefully that's all taken care of in the next video. We'll see you then.